How does someone find the courage to take an axe to a sacred tree worshipped by warrior tribes? What kind of faith can stand against death threats from druids and the fury of pagan gods? Why did the monk who destroyed Thor's oak become the architect of Christian Europe? And what kind of faith drives a man to face an empire of gods with nothing but conviction and an axe? This is the story of Saint Boniface, the axe-wielding missionary who conquered paganism. If you've ever wondered whether faith can triumph over seemingly impossible odds, this story will show you that sometimes the greatest victories require the most dramatic confrontations. Hit like and subscribe for more untold histories of courage and belief. In the green monastery of Nursling, nestled in the rolling hills of Wessex, a young monk named Winfrid was gaining a reputation as one of the finest scholars in England. Born around 675 AD into a prosperous Anglo-Saxon family, he had been given to the monastery as a child and had never known any life beyond its peaceful walls. Picture the scriptorium where young Winfrid spent his days, sunlight streaming through tall windows as he bent over manuscripts, copying sacred texts with meticulous care. His fellow monks marveled at his quick intelligence, his mastery of Latin and Greek, and his gift for explaining complex theological concepts with crystal clarity. By his 30s, Winfrid had become one of the most respected teachers in England. Students traveled from across the kingdom to study under him. Bishops sought his counsel on difficult questions of doctrine and canon law. His future seemed assured. A comfortable life of scholarship, teaching, and gradual advancement through the church hierarchy. But Winfrid felt a restlessness that all his scholarly achievements couldn't satisfy. The peaceful routine of monastic life, the intellectual debates that fascinated his colleagues, the prospect of becoming an abbot or bishop, none of it stirred his soul the way it should have. What he craved was not comfort but challenge, not safety, but the chance to risk everything for the gospel. Late at night, while his brothers slept, Winfrid would read accounts of the great missionaries: St. Patrick in Ireland, St. Columba in Scotland, St. Augustine in England, men who had left everything familiar to carry Christ's light into pagan darkness. The call came gradually, then suddenly. Reports were reaching England of vast populations in Germanic lands who had never heard the gospel. Saxons, Frisians, Thuringians, and Bavarians who still worshipped the old gods in sacred groves and offered human sacrifices to ensure good harvests. The idea seized Winfrid's imagination like a fever. Here was a mission worthy of complete devotion, a challenge that would test every aspect of his faith and abilities. But first, he would need to convince his superiors to let him go. When Winfrid announced his intention to become a missionary to the Germans, the reaction was swift and negative. His abbot was horrified at the thought of losing his most brilliant scholar. His fellow monks thought he had lost his mind. Why would someone with every earthly advantage choose to risk death among barbarian tribes? But Winfrid's greatest challenge was yet to come. In 716 AD, Winfrid finally received permission for his first missionary journey. With a small band of companions, he sailed across the North Sea to Frisia, the marshy coastal region that is now the Netherlands, where fierce warrior tribes, ruled by King Radbod, had resisted all previous attempts at evangelization. Picture the fog-shrouded coastline as Winfrid's boat approached Frisian shores. Knowing that these waters had claimed previous missionaries and that the pagan king had recently expelled all Christian priests from his territory, the timing could not have been worse. Radbod was at war with the Christian Franks, and any association with Christianity was seen as treason against Frisian independence. When Winfrid and his companions attempted to preach, they were met with hostility that quickly turned violent. The mission was a complete disaster. Within months, Winfrid was forced to flee back to England, his dreams of missionary glory shattered by the harsh reality of pagan resistance. For a man who had never failed at anything, the experience was devastating. Back at Nursling, Winfrid faced the sympathetic but knowing looks of his fellow monks. They had warned him that his scholarly gifts were too valuable to waste on dangerous adventures. Perhaps now he would settle down to the comfortable academic life for which God had obviously intended him. But failure only strengthened Winfrid's resolve. Instead of abandoning his missionary calling, he began preparing more thoroughly. He studied everything available about Germanic languages, customs, and religious beliefs. He corresponded with missionaries already working on the continent, learning from their successes and failures. Most importantly, Winfrid made a decision that would define his entire future strategy. He would seek official papal authorization for his mission, giving him authority that no local king or chieftain could challenge. Have you ever had a failure that redirected you toward your true calling? In 718, Winfrid set out for Rome, determined to gain Pope Gregory II's blessing for a new missionary campaign. The journey across Europe was itself an education in the religious and political complexities he would face. What happened in Rome would transform not just Winfrid's mission, but his entire identity. Picture the ancient halls of the Lateran Palace, where Pope Gregory II received the earnest English monk who had traveled so far to seek his blessing. Gregory was immediately impressed by Winfrid's combination of scholarly brilliance and passionate commitment to missionary work. But the Pope's response went far beyond anything Winfrid had expected. Instead of simply blessing his mission, Gregory gave him a new name, Boniface, meaning doer of good, and appointed him as his personal representative to all the Germanic tribes. He was no longer just another missionary, but the Pope's official agent with authority to establish churches, ordain priests, and create the entire structure of Christian civilization. The commission was staggering in its scope. Gregory was essentially asking Boniface to convert and organize an area larger than England, populated by dozens of different tribes, each with their own kings, customs, and deeply rooted pagan traditions. But with papal authority came papal protection. Boniface now carried letters that commanded respect from Christian rulers throughout Europe. More importantly, he possessed spiritual authority that even pagan kings would recognize. He was not just a foreign priest, but the representative of the most powerful religious figure in the Western world. Armed with this new authority, Boniface returned to Frisia in 719, arriving to find the situation dramatically changed. King Radbod had died, and his successor was more open to Christian influence. The Frankish kingdom had expanded its control over much of the region, providing political stability that previous missionaries had lacked. This time, Boniface's mission succeeded spectacularly. Thousands of Frisians converted to Christianity. Churches were built where pagan temples had stood. Boniface established schools, trained local priests, and created the foundation for a Christian society that would endure for centuries. But Frisia was only the beginning. Reports were reaching Boniface of even more challenging fields. The deep forests of Germany, where ancient gods still held sway over warrior tribes who had never submitted to any foreign authority. What would you do if success in one impossible mission led to an even greater challenge? Boniface's greatest test was about to begin in the heartland of Germanic paganism, where he would face gods older than Rome and druids who wielded power that seemed to bridge the natural and supernatural worlds. In 722 AD, Boniface penetrated deep into the German forest, reaching Hesse, a region where no Christian missionary had ever successfully established a permanent presence. This was the heartland of Germanic paganism, where ancient gods were worshipped in sacred groves and human sacrifices ensured the favor of supernatural powers. Picture the vast Teutonic forests, their towering trees, creating cathedral-like spaces, where shafts of sunlight illuminated moss-covered altars to Thor, Wodan, and other deities, whose names struck fear into the hearts of those who served them. The challenge Boniface faced was unlike anything previous missionaries had encountered. These weren't merely ignorant pagans who needed education about Christianity. They were sophisticated religious practitioners with a complex mythology, organized priesthood, and centuries-old traditions that governed every aspect of their lives. The pagan priests, the equivalents of Celtic druids, possessed genuine supernatural knowledge. They could predict the weather, heal diseases, and invoke curses that had measurable effects on their enemies. Their power wasn't just religious, but political and social, making them the most influential figures in Germanic society. Boniface's strategy was characteristically bold. Instead of gradually introducing Christian concepts or finding common ground with pagan beliefs, he chose direct confrontation. He would challenge the Germanic gods to spiritual combat, testing whether Christ's power was greater than Thor's thunder or Wodan's magic. The moment that would define his entire mission came when Boniface encountered the sacred Oak of Thor at Geismar, a massive tree that had been worshipped for centuries as the dwelling place of the thunder god. Local tribes brought offerings to the oak, seeking Thor's protection in battle and his blessing on their crops. The tree was more than just a religious symbol. It was the spiritual center of the entire region, the place where heaven and earth met, where the power of the old gods was most concentrated and visible. When Boniface announced his intention to cut down Thor's oak, the reaction was explosive. Pagan priests warned that anyone who dared touch the sacred tree would be struck dead by the thunder god's wrath. Tribal warriors gathered to prevent the sacrilege, certain that destroying the oak would bring disaster upon their entire people. What kind of faith does it take to challenge the gods themselves? But Boniface was about to demonstrate that some battles can only be won through complete commitment to the truth, regardless of the consequences. Picture the clearing at Geismar, where hundreds of Germanic tribesmen gathered to witness what they were certain would be the death of the mad Christian priest who dared challenge Thor himself. Warriors stood with hands on sword hilts, ready to strike down Boniface the moment the thunder god's lightning flashed in response to his sacrilege. Pagan priests chanted incantations and made offerings, calling on Thor to defend his sacred dwelling. The very air seemed charged with supernatural tension as Boniface approached the massive oak with nothing but an axe and unshakable faith in Christ's supremacy over all other powers. As Boniface raised his axe to strike the first blow, the crowd held its breath. This was more than the destruction of a tree. It was a supernatural showdown between Christianity and paganism, between the God of the Bible and the ancient gods of Germania. The axe bit deep into Thor's oak, then again and again. With each strike, the silence grew more profound. Thor's thunder did not sound. Lightning did not flash. The earth did not tremble. The mighty oak, symbol of divine power for countless generations, began to sway and crack under the blows of a single determined monk. When the great tree finally crashed to the forest floor, the psychological impact was more devastating than any military defeat. If Thor could not protect his own sacred dwelling, what power did the old gods really possess? But Boniface's masterstroke was what happened next. Instead of simply leaving the fallen oak as a symbol of pagan defeat, he used its wood to build a chapel dedicated to St. Peter, transforming the very material that had housed Thor into a dwelling place for the Christian god. The conversion that followed was unprecedented in missionary history. Entire tribes abandoned their ancestral gods and accepted baptism. Pagan priests became Christian ministers. Sacred groves became church sites. But Boniface understood that destroying the old was only half the work. He needed to build something better in its place. Have you ever seen the power of a single bold action to change everything? From Geismar, Boniface's mission exploded across Germany. His reputation as the man who had defeated Thor spread faster than his actual presence, opening doors that would have remained closed to ordinary missionaries. But his greatest achievement was yet to come: the creation of a Christian civilization that would shape European history for 1,000 years. Following his triumph at Thor's Oak, Boniface spent the next 2 decades systematically transforming Germanic society from pagan tribalism to Christian civilization. His approach was revolutionary in its comprehensiveness. He didn't just convert individuals, but rebuilt entire cultures from the ground up. Picture the monasteries that began appearing throughout the German forests, each one a center of learning, agriculture, and technological innovation. These weren't just religious communities, but the seeds of cities, universities, and the entire infrastructure of medieval civilization. Boniface's genius lay in his understanding that lasting conversion required more than dramatic moments of spiritual warfare. It needed education, organization, and the patient work of cultural transformation that would make Christianity not just an alternative to paganism, but a superior way of life. He established schools that taught not only Christian doctrine, but also practical skills, reading, writing, mathematics, and agricultural techniques that improved crop yields and quality of life. Former pagan warriors became Christian knights. Tribal chieftains became Christian nobility. Scattered settlements became organized parishes with permanent priests and regular sacraments. But Boniface's most important innovation was his systematic training of indigenous clergy. Instead of relying on foreign missionaries who didn't understand local customs and languages, he identified promising young Germans and provided them with thorough theological education. These German priests and bishops became the permanent foundation of Christianity in their homeland. They could preach in native languages, understand cultural concerns, and provide leadership that wouldn't disappear when foreign missionaries moved on to other fields. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, Germanic tribes that had been among Europe's most ferocious pagans were sending their own missionaries to other regions. The converted had become converters, the evangelized had become evangelists. What would it take to transform an entire civilization's understanding of reality? By 740, Boniface had been appointed Archbishop of Mainz, making him the senior Christian authority in all of Germany. But he was already dreaming of even greater challenges: missionary work among the Saxons, the most warlike and religiously conservative of all Germanic tribes. This final mission would test everything Boniface had learned about confronting paganism, and it would ultimately cost him his life. As Boniface entered his 70s, he might have been content to enjoy the fruits of his extraordinary missionary career. He had converted more pagans than perhaps any Christian since St. Paul. He had established the church structure that would govern Germany for centuries. He was honored throughout Europe as the Apostle of Germany and lived in comfort befitting his high ecclesiastical rank, but the old fire still burned within him. Reports reached Boniface of Frisian tribes along the northern coast who had reverted to paganism after his earlier missionary work. The challenge was irresistible. Could the methods that had conquered Thor's Oak succeed again among the stubborn Frisians? In 754, despite the protests of his fellow bishops and the monks who served under him, Boniface organized one final missionary expedition. At age 79, carrying only the books needed for celebration of Mass and confirmation of new converts, he set out for Frisia with a small band of companions. Picture the marshy Frisian coastland, where fog rolled in from the North Sea and ancient gods still held sway over tribal councils. This was dangerous territory for Christian missionaries. Previous attempts at evangelization had ended in bloodshed and martyrdom, but Boniface's reputation preceded him. Word spread that the great destroyer of Thor's Oak was coming to challenge the Frisian gods. Some tribesmen were curious to see this legendary figure. Others were determined to prevent him from repeating his German successes in their homeland. The mission began promisingly. Hundreds of Frisians came to hear Boniface preach, and many requested baptism. The old monk's combination of spiritual authority and practical wisdom impressed even skeptical chieftains. It seemed that his final mission might prove as successful as his earlier conquests. But pagan priests, who had seen their power broken in Germany, were determined not to let the same fate befall Frisia. They began spreading word that Boniface was a foreign agent whose real purpose was to make the Frisians subservient to Christian kings. The confrontation came at dawn on June 5, 754, near the town of Dockum. Picture Boniface's camp beside a small river, where the elderly archbishop was preparing to celebrate Mass and confirm new converts. Fog drifted across the water as armed Frisians approached through the morning mist. Boniface's companions urged him to flee, but the old missionary refused. "This is the day I have long awaited," he said calmly. "Trust in God, and do not fear those who kill the body but cannot touch the soul." When the attackers reached the camp, they found Boniface kneeling in prayer, a gospel book open before him. According to witnesses, he raised the book to shield himself as the swords fell, choosing to die protecting the word of God rather than defending his own life. The Apostle of Germany had won his final victory, not through the spectacular destruction of pagan symbols, but through the witness of a martyr's death that would inspire German Christians for centuries to come. The martyrdom of Saint Boniface sent shockwaves throughout Christian Europe, but nowhere more powerfully than in the German territories he had spent his life evangelizing. The news that their beloved apostle had been killed by pagan Frisians sparked a religious revival that completed the Christianization of Central Europe. Picture the churches and monasteries Boniface had established, where monks and priests who had been trained by him carried on his work with renewed fervor. His death had proved that the gospel was worth dying for, validating every sermon he had preached and every sacrifice he had demanded. The Germanic tribes that Boniface had converted became the driving force behind European Christianity's expansion. German missionaries carried the faith eastward into Slavic lands. German scholars preserved and transmitted classical learning through the Dark Ages. German knights became the backbone of the crusading movement. But perhaps Boniface's greatest legacy was his demonstration that Christianity could triumph over any opposition through the combination of supernatural faith and practical wisdom. The monk who had wielded an axe against Thor's oak had shown that some battles require dramatic confrontation, while others demand patient cultural transformation. The methods Boniface pioneered, direct challenge to pagan symbols, followed by systematic education and organization, became the template for missionary work throughout medieval Europe. His approach proved that effective evangelization requires both spiritual warfare and institutional building. Modern archaeology has confirmed the accuracy of medieval accounts about Boniface's impact. Excavations throughout Germany reveal the sudden replacement of pagan temples with Christian churches in the decades following his missions. The material evidence supports the written records of mass conversions and cultural transformation. Today, Saint Boniface is honored as the patron saint of Germany and of missionaries worldwide. His feast day, June 5, the anniversary of his martyrdom, is celebrated throughout Europe as a reminder that the gospel can triumph over any opposition when proclaimed with sufficient faith and courage. The scholar who left his comfortable monastery to challenge gods in their sacred groves proved that Christianity's greatest victories often require its most dramatic risks. The monk who took an axe to Thor's oak demonstrated that some truths can only be established through actions that seem impossible to those who don't share the actor's faith. From the quiet scriptorium of Nursling to the bloody ground at Docum, from Thor's oak to the churches of Germany, Boniface's life proclaimed the eternal truth that no power, earthly or supernatural, can ultimately resist the advance of God's kingdom when it is proclaimed by those willing to stake everything on its reality. The axe-wielding missionary who conquered paganism reminds us that faith without risk is just religion, but faith with total commitment can literally move mountains and fell the mightiest trees sacred to the mightiest gods.